Let's start our weekly briefing by traditionally what we do is that we take a look at the main events that took place in the previous month, in this case in October. Starting our list with the WTO Public Forum meeting. I think it's interesting to realize that the meeting is growing every year. This year we had a huge number of sessions that were proposed, and the forum gained an additional day, so 4 days in Geneva. And this year the meeting was structured around three key pillars of discussion. The main goal was to look back and continue the discussions that happened last year, in which sessions try to identify what are the key issues that are impacting change and directing change in trade in the future. And they tried as well this year to identify how the trade system should respond to these changes. So the sessions were organized under three main pillars. The first one was the trading services, to discuss trading services. A recent report has been published by the WTO, pointing out that within the trade sector, trading services is the most dynamic area. And as we know, a lot of the push for the growth in trading services is happening because of digital technology and digitization that allows a cross-border trade of services that were non-tradable before. The second pillar of discussion in the WTO Public Forum was Generation Z and how trade is impacting their lives. As we know, a lot of new companies and startups are created by young people, and the forum tried to discuss how the trade system can create enabling conditions so the future generations can benefit from trade. And the third pillar was related to the trade system itself. As we know, there has been lots of discussion about reforming the trade system and making sure that the WTO is brought up to speed to face this context of changes that we see with the digital economy. So reforms of the WTO was the third pillar of discussion during the forum. And that the Digital Watch provided just-in-time reporting from these different sessions that were related to digital issues. And what we could notice from reporting the sessions was that themes that will be likely discussed in the next forum, WTO Ministerial, were really prominent. So we're talking about here as well issues related to taxation, which are a big issue. Issues related to how e-commerce is impacting actors such as small and medium-sized companies, how to make sure that marginalized communities and sectors can benefit from trade, such as not only young people and women. So there was a clear trend when it comes to inclusion. And as well, one of the key topics that will be discussed in the ministerial is e-commerce negotiations, which are taking place in a plurilateral setting at the WTO. Things that will be important within this e-commerce negotiations were pretty much discussed in different sessions too. So we can see the public forum as a warm-up to the WTO ministerial that will be happening in a few months, and we will be covering these developments until the WTO ministerial. So other meetings that took place this month, there was also the GFCE annual meeting in Addis Ababa. This meeting was really interesting because a lot of work streams that function within the framework of the GFCE came to sort of a conclusion about their work. So we could see the publication of interesting documents and the launch of a new platform, which is called CyBio, that will be a key resource when it comes to understanding what are the resources that are available for capacity building when it comes to cybersecurity that actors can use in their everyday lives and activities to build capacity in the field. So this is an interesting platform, and Diplo and the Geneva Internet platform are contributing to CyBio, and we will keep you informed about that. This month we also had other interesting meetings, such as a meeting of RIPE that took place in Rotterdam, WIPO conference 2019. As always, digital issues are very prominent in the work of the organizations. Since the Internet treaties, a lot of discussions are dedicated to digital issues in WIPO agenda. And we also had a conference on International Conference on Data Protection and Privacy that took place in Tirana. So these were the main events that took place in October. I think we can move on now to the main developments of the month and see our barometer. The barometer, as we know, show us the trends that are becoming more important in comparison to previous months. The issues that stayed more or less the same when it comes to their importance, and issues that are relatively less important if compared to previous months. So we see, for instance, when it comes to the global IG architecture, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Extreme Poverty highlights the negative impact of emerging technologies. This is a topic that has been recurrent. As we know, several organizations, since the World Bank report on digital dividends in 2016, have called attention to the fact that digital technologies have increased inequalities in different parts of the world between developed and developing countries, and of course, as well within societies. So this is a topic that not only the UN and human rights bodies have been calling attention to, but also economic organizations such as the World Bank. More recently, Unctad and the WEF also released reports in the same direction. So the second one was sustainable development. This topic is gaining importance. It is interesting to mention that in the WTO Public Forum, for instance, there was a huge number of sessions discussing trade and environment. This was not foreseen by the organizers. Trade and environment was not a pillar of the WTO Public Forum, but there were sessions spontaneously proposed under this topic. I think it reverberates the movement that is going on globally when it comes to raising awareness of environmental issues. Sustainable development was a topic that was really high this month. When it comes to different technologies that can be applied to sustainable development and to achieving SDGs, such as AI technologies, for instance, and new reports, of course, are being published in this area, and data is being gathered to ensure that new technologies are a vehicle for change in a positive direction for development that is equitable and brings benefits to all. Moving on, when it comes to security, we have Vlada here. We see that this topic is gaining importance. And Vlada, why don't you comment a little bit on the importance that security is gaining when it comes to the general digital landscape?
Thank you, Marilia. Again, as always, with security, some good and some bad news. The bad news is definitely we have more cases of the data breaches and compromised devices and so on. The good news is that there are also some success stories like this one in combating child abuse. But probably the two most important bits here, one that we'll touch a little bit later on when we discuss the surveillance trends, is related to encryption. And the other one is interesting. The Netherlands has made public its position on applicability on international law in cyberspace. It's basically, it has published a document which the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands has sent to the Parliament 2 months ago, or I think it was maybe in June already, but it was not published. And it actually goes into very many details of aspects of international law, things like the self-defense and the ways the country might react on cyber attacks, the various principles such as proportionality, then the concept of sovereignty. So a lot of technical, in the sense of legal details, which have not been tackled much by the states officially before. The previous, most recent case was actually the French position just a month ago. We have reported on that also in Digital Watch, where the Ministry of Defense there went into detail. So before that, we had a couple of very few, much lighter positions, such as those of Estonia and the UK. But this seems like a trend, at least when it comes to European countries, that the European countries are trying to set the trend of clearly explaining their positions in nitty-gritty, in details. And we can even see some of the differences in positions between France and UK and the Netherlands. How can this impact the future processes, particularly the group of governmental experts in the open-ended working group in the UN. Well, basically, thus far, what we have seen was the great agreement of most of the countries around the world that international law applies to cyberspace, but not into details. And we have seen the general agreement on the norms, which are voluntary, non-binding norms. This might set the trend in actually going into details. We are still to see how other countries, particularly those that might not agree with the European positions, will whether they are going to open up, meaning Russia, China, probably the other players like Brazil, South Africa, India, whether at some near future they might open their positions in so many details. And also the big question is whether the US, which has still been more or less silent on details of how it sees the application of international law, whether the US is also going to come up with more clear position on their own. The next sort of a test or development will be the GG meeting in December, also the open-ended working group, open consultations. But the GG is having its first meeting in December, and it will be quite interesting to follow to what extent the Dutch position, the French position will influence the discussions and the details of discussions in the GG. But we'll certainly get back to that in December while we'll be following the GG. Back to you, Marilia.
Thank you very much for this updates on security, Vlada. As always, security is an animated field with good and bad news. We can move on now to e-commerce and internet security. Oh, sorry, internet economy, still on security. I think what we have to call attention to mostly under this topic this month is related to taxation. And taxation is one of the key policy tools that policymakers are trying to put in place to ensure that the benefits of the digital economy, as we mentioned before, are more evenly distributed. Policymakers are increasingly aware that the data of their citizens is being used to create value elsewhere, but not necessarily benefiting their citizens. So the discussion on taxation is very hard. We have been following it for months here in the Digital Watch. Different countries have different ideas on how the taxation of the digital economy and large platforms should take place. The novelty in this field is that the OECD has just launched a consultation on a very important document. The work on the OECD in this area is happening under a framework which is called the Baxter Framework, the base erosion and profit shifting. This is a joint project that has been carried out by the OECD and the G20, and it tries to tackle two main problems. The first of them is the sharing of the revenues, the benefits that are being accrued by large companies that are part of the digital economy. The second pillar is to try to ensure that companies do not practice a forum shifting when it comes to paying their taxes and choose countries that are more lenient when it comes to enforcing tax rules. So these two pillars, they have been moving forward. When it comes to the base erosion mechanism, there was a report published in 2015, but as we know, when it comes to really allocating profit, different countries have had different positions, and they tried to build consensus on the European level recently. This was not possible, so some countries decided to move forward unilaterally. France has been put forward and approved a bill that taxes large companies. This caused huge repercussion in the US. The UK is also studying to implement a similar law next year. But both these countries said that they would revert these laws if an international solution was found. This international solution is being discussed for some time under the OECD, but the Secretariat trying to move forward and try to find a consensus proposal. They have advanced a new document that tries to build on bits and pieces that have been proposed by different member states, and it has been published as an attempt of finding a consensus solution. This document is under public consultation right now. It will last until the end of the year, and many countries are seeing the OECD as the hope for finding an international way forward on the discussions on taxation. During the WTO Public Forum, again, this discussion was really prominent, and companies as well, such as Google, which were present in the Public Forum, have said that they look forward to having an international solution, because for companies, the current situation is not ideal either. So this is the key development that we would like to emphasize under e-commerce and the internet economy. We will have our newsletter coming up towards the end of this month, and you can read about different developments. In the field of digital rights, there have been some interesting reports published, again by the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom on opinion, which urge governments and companies to protect vulnerable groups and the target of hate speech. The reports have also called attention to the fact that more and more digital technologies, including advanced technologies such as biometric schemes of identification that have been put in place in several countries, they are being used on the one hand to increase the reliability of public services, but also in the other hand as a means of control of the population. So the use of advanced technologies for surveillance is something that is being really prominent when it comes to the discussion of digital rights. Moving on to jurisdiction, we had a very interesting decision coming from the Court of Justice of the European Union, which has ruled in a case that Facebook was supposed to remove worldwide content that has been deemed illegal in a particular European jurisdiction. This issue has been really controversial. There is a clear clash between laws of certain jurisdictions that are not very permissible when it comes to speech and rule hate speech, for instance, something illegal, but other jurisdictions that have more freedom of speech enshrined in their regulations. Facebook now, it's supposed to delete content that is exactly the same as the content that has been deemed illegal in a particular European jurisdiction. And the company has issued a statement on this regard and arguing that they are against the decision because it undermines the long-standing principle that one country does not have the right to impose its laws on speech on another country. So again, the issue of jurisdiction and the extraterritorial effects of court decisions has been very prominent in this case, and will probably continue to be very important in years to come. When it comes to infrastructure, the importance and the relevance of this topic remained more or less stable. And we saw a relative decline when it comes to network neutrality. We did have a boost of different decisions coming from the US and the FCC, but things are a little bit quieter now, and the relative importance of net neutrality has reduced. Coming to the field of new technologies, which include artificial intelligence, we have seen in recent months that a lot has happened in the field of artificial intelligence. We have predicted in the beginning of the year that this field will probably reach a bit more maturity, both in terms of technology and in terms of governance arrangements. I think our predictions were partially correct. When it comes to the technology, there have been some very interesting development when it comes to researchers in the field of brain and artificial intelligence integration. However, this still is in the early beginnings and a bit far-fetched if we look at the state of technology now. And when it comes to governance arrangements, we are seeing a few different initiatives mushrooming in different organizations. It seems like every organization wants to grab a piece of artificial intelligence and have a little bit of stake in building the laws for artificial intelligence. But we also see a lot of replication going on as well. For instance, the Council of Europe is now studying to put in place a regulatory framework on AI and ethics. At the same time, the European Union also wants to put in place a regulatory framework on ethics, so perhaps a little bit more coordination between different institutions is necessary to reach this level of maturity that we hope for. Although there are some specific areas of artificial intelligence that have matured in recent months. There have been regulations approved when it comes to face recognition in different countries. In the US, 4 states now have deemed facial recognition something that is forbidden. At the same time, India has deployed the face recognition in different airports. So we see different positions when it comes to the regulatory approach of facial recognition, but the governance in this particular application of AI is definitely maturing, which is a good thing. So these were the key issues that we wanted to emphasize in our barometer. So moving on to the main trends that we can see. What are the policy trends that we can predict when we look into the future? Well, the first of them is related to surveillance. There has been renewed calls for governments for backdoors access and new tools for surveillance, probably related to the investigation of crimes and terrorism. But I will give the microphone to Vlada so he can explore this first trend. Vlada.
Thank you, Marilia. There are a couple of components of this, and we decided to put all under this umbrella of surveillance, which is probably not the only way to do. There are a couple of updates, as you mentioned. I'll start from the couple of reports. Basically, the key one is probably the annual report of the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, which basically found out or concluded that the social welfare systems, the digital social welfare systems, have the potential to become surveillance tools. And we might be aware of why this is, because all of the personal data are becoming connected together, particularly those related to social welfare. And interestingly, this report, I encourage you to run through, has quite some strong language. And one of the quotes that's worth mentioning is, what the report says is, there is a grave risk of stumbling zombie-like into a digital welfare dystopia. So it's quite interesting, the set of messages that we received from the report. A couple of other reports by private sector and NGOs, such as the UK-based company Comparitech, and they've done a ranking study, basically, of 47 countries based on the surveillance, I wouldn't say habits, but trends. According to them, China is one on the top of the list, that they're not just failing to protect the citizens' privacy, but also actively invading it in a way, and that as the digital ID programs are booming, we can expect probably more of that. But they also, for instance, mentioned the EU countries, which tend to share a large amount of their citizens' data with fellow member states. Of course, the GDPR, and they also underline that, plays an important role in protecting the, or as a sort of a privacy safeguards. But they concluded that basically none of the 47 countries that they evaluated earns a perfect score, and even not a near perfect score, and there is much to be done. Another study which was done by the Open Technology Fund and the German cybersecurity firm looks into or warns that there is an educational app in China, Study the Great Nation, which has some sort of a backdoor, whether it is purposely by the government or by the company, but anyhow, it potentially allows breaking the cryptographic algorithms and getting into the sensitive data that people share. And the third part of that is the US decision, quite an unusual for the US, at least the US people would probably say that. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which works based on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, ruled that some of the FBI electronic surveillance activities, in some of the cases, not too many, violate the constitutional privacy right. Particularly related to the improper access to databases by the FBI agents, which is quite an interesting update coming from the US. The second big component of this trend is as you mentioned earlier, is the renewed call for backdoor access. So basically, we have seen the letter by the high official of the US, UK, and Australia to Mark Zuckerberg, asking Facebook to basically put on hold its decision to embed end-to-end encryption into the Facebook messengers. You might know that most of the other Facebook-owned messengers like the WhatsApp basically has end-to-end encryption. With this step, Facebook would somehow encompass all its communication services with end-to-end encryption. And the US, UK, and Australian high officials basically asked them and other companies to put on hold such decisions before they ensure that the law enforcement authorities can access the data when needed. Interestingly, in this case, usually the national security dominates this discourse, but in this case, while they mentioned the need to combat terrorism as well, the officials basically raised the case of child protection and protecting the child from sexual abuse and so on, which is basically a strong card, because around the world we can say that probably there is the biggest agreement on any topic is combating the child sexual abuse. In a way, they're trying to find a way to embed some sort of a backdoor or the ability of law enforcement to follow the communications. We have seen also, I think it was last month, or 2 months ago, a blog, an interesting article, basically published by the security folks from the TCHQ, the UK security service, which was an open call for discussion on possible ways to do it in a legal way, legal or legitimate way that wouldn't endanger privacy. This was, while the proposal was criticized by a number of NGOs, the very attempt to actually openly discuss something like that by the professionals in the security service might be seen as a good sign. Now, this letter is a little bit different. It openly invites Facebook to hold on. Facebook responded that they strongly oppose any sort of a government meddling because it can diminish the trust in their services and certainly privacy and so on. And the last part of this discussion on the surveillance, if we can put it, is again back to the UN Special Rapporteur report of the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty Human Rights, where they mentioned that the new technologies like biometrics, smart cards, algorithms, and AI will probably cause more and more of the trouble for privacy and data protection. Another report by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which was published in September, says that at least 75 countries are actively using artificial intelligence technology, including facial recognition systems, smart city platforms, and others for some sort of surveillance. They underline the role of Huawei, which provides such tools to at least 55 countries around the world, but they also outline the role of the US companies, IBM, Palantir, and Cisco, which supply AI surveillance technology to 32 countries. So we see that there is a general trend, and that certainly they underline that the facial recognition technology will be or is becoming more and more a surveillance tool, but we'll get back to that in a minute. Marilia, back to you.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive overview, Vlada. And I think that your comment was a good segue, actually, for what Sorina is going to tell us about developments on artificial intelligence, more specifically on facial recognition, which, as we mentioned, is one of the areas that perhaps the governance of AI technology is being developed in a steady pace. Sorina.
Thank you, Marilia. Hello, everyone. Indeed, there are quite a few things happening with regard to facial recognition technology, and we saw quite a few updates over the past few months. For example, in July and August, there was a big trend on development in this area, and now we see again a few interesting updates, so we'll go quickly through some of them. First of all, there are some new uses of facial recognition technology, or at least some new reports on uses of facial recognition technology. And the first one is in France, which is about to roll out facial recognition digital ID mobile application. It is called Addis, and it is basically already in use since June as part of a pilot test, and apparently the government is planning to roll it out throughout the country as of November. They say the app is going to be used to access services such as banking, paying taxes, social security, and even paying utility services. It's not extremely clear how it will work, but at least in terms of recognition, the app is supposed to link the data in a biometric document of the user. It can be, for example, a biometric passport, and then cross-check the picture in that chip with image of the face of the individual through facial recognition technology, for example, through a phone. The app is being developed by the Interior Ministry together with some private companies, and the ministry is saying that the facial recognition data that is collected when the cross-checking of data is being done will be deleted. Now, again, that's something to be seen. And as usual with facial recognition technology, there are concerns. On the one hand, the Data Protection Authority is saying that the app could be breaching legal provisions about consent if the government is going to ask or make it mandatory for certain public services to be used or be accessible only via the app. And there are also security concerns. There was a hacker a few months ago who actually claimed he was able to break the app within little over than an hour. So that raises serious security concerns. And that's in France. We will see if the government rolls out the app next month, which is almost here. And then we move in Shanghai, where apparently there are over 10,000 apartment buildings that have already installed facial recognition technology. And they say this has been done in cooperation with the local police to help them identify suspicious persons and prevent crimes. And of course, the citizens are complaining, arguing that they have not even been informed about the use of these technologies in the apartment buildings or of the plans to install such technology. So as we have seen in previous cases, and we see this month again, there are different cases where the facial recognition technology is being used for good purposes, also for questionable ones. The question is, again, maybe not the tool itself, but rather how it is being used and what privacy safeguards are being put in place. And this takes us to the policy concerns and the fact that some authorities are deciding to ban the technology, at least some cases of the technology. And we're back to the US. Marilia has just mentioned a bit earlier a few things about this. In New York, to start with, lawmakers are discussing actually 3 bills to regulate the use of facial recognition. These are all draft bills. They are being discussed in the state legislative body, but it's interesting to see what's happening there. The first bill is supposed to prevent building owners from making it mandatory for tenants to use facial recognition and biometric data to access their homes. So the bill is basically saying you cannot oblige a homeowner to use facial recognition to enter into the building. And the other 2 bills would be imposing guidelines on businesses and landlords using facial recognition technology. For example, they would be asked to register with the city authorities, and then the details of the facial recognition technology being used would be included on a publicly accessible database, so people would be informed about the installation and use of the technology. The bills are welcomed by citizens, of course, and many of them are actually asking for a complete ban on the use of facial recognition. Also in the US, California passed the bill banning the use of facial recognition by law enforcement. Actually, the bill was initially approved in the Senate last month. This month it was passed in the Assembly and also signed off by the governor. What the bill is saying is that law enforcement authorities cannot use facial recognition technology on officer body cameras, and the bill is only supposed to be enforced until January 2023. So for only 3 years, and then there will be an assessment of the state of technology and potential uses. As with previous cases, this ban is also motivated by human rights consideration, the legislator saying that it poses threats to civil liberties and rights, and also that the use of facial recognition body cameras would transform them into surveillance devices, basically police officers being able to surveil citizens at all times. Still in the US, there was an interesting report in the New York Times about a huge facial recognition database called Megaface, which contains images of hundreds of thousands of individuals, including children, uploaded over years on Flickr. Apparently, this huge database is being used by more than 100 entities, including big companies like Google and Amazon, to train the facial recognition algorithms. And the problem here is, of course, the consent. Did users actually consented to their data, their images being uploaded in this database? And the answer is obviously not really. So that's another interesting revelation about data being used within the context of facial recognition. In Russia, there is an interesting lawsuit being brought up by an activist, a human rights activist, against the use of facial recognition by the city authorities in Moscow. The activist was actually inspired in launching the suit after she learned that facial recognition technology cameras were used to identify her within a protest, sometimes in April last year, and she was later identified and fined for being part of that protest. She is arguing that the system which uses biometric data is doing so without the consent of users, so basically violating the law on personal data protection. And Moscow has been using facial recognition technologies for quite a while now. The city authorities have been recognizing this, and last month there were reports about the local authorities ordering the acquisition of new technologies for monitoring mass gatherings. So things still happen with or without lawsuit against the use of the technology. And one last update, which is quite opposite from these few mentioned updates. In Sweden, the Data Protection Authority issued a decision which says that law enforcement, specifically the police, is able to use facial recognition to help identify criminal suspects. The DPA says that the impact assessment that the police provided had enough privacy assurance for it to approve the use of the technology, basically saying that there are appropriate technological and organizational measures to ensure that the data is adequately protected. Still, the police has to make sure that it sets a specific time limit for storing the biometric data that it collects from the facial recognition cameras. So there are quite different trends about the use or regulation of facial recognition. Many authorities are still using them, others are imposing bans on them, others are approving them. So it's a bit of going all over the place with this, and we will be keeping track of developments in this area. As Maria said, there will be the newsletter published at the end of the month, and more updates there, and also on the Digital Watch newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serena, for this very comprehensive overview. I found it really interesting that impact assessments are being used as a tool. Usually it's a tool coming from environmental regulation. We do a lot of environmental impact assessment, but not enough human rights impact assessments. I'm afraid they are common in certain areas, but not all. We did discuss this a lot. I remember when we were starting to discuss human rights in Icann in the context of the GDPR. It will be interesting to see if other authorities will resort to the mechanism of impact assessments as well, and what will be the parameters in the future. We're moving on to our third and last trend. It is a very interesting one. As we know, digital currencies are taking the world by storm, not only in the private sector, but also being increasingly adopted, or at least studied by public authorities with the aim of future adoption. We have seen in past months that China is studying to adopt a digital yuan, but Facebook has plans announced since 2018 to launch their digital currency, Libra, and they want to launch it next year. They have put together the Libra Association. We have saw that in previous months, and the association has just been chartered in Geneva, so it will be a neighbor for many of us who are based in Geneva. We can walk from our office in Diplo to the Libra Association and pay them a visit perhaps in the future. But Arvin, there have been some interesting developments related to the hearing of Mark Zuckerberg in the US Congress before the Financial Committee, and very interesting questions were asked. So what are the latest developments?
Thank you, Marilia, and hi to all. Of course, as Marilia mentioned, this month was really, Facebook was scrutinized around this development of the Libra cryptocurrency, and Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg had to testify in front of the U.S. Senate. But we'll mention that a minute later. But just to give you an overview, what actually happened in October regarding the Libra and worldwide the cryptocurrency project. First, at the beginning of October, we heard that major online retailers and credit card companies, PayPal, MasterCard, Visa, eBay, and Stripe, actually departed from the Libra cryptocurrency project. Why? First of all, PayPal announced a withdrawal first and actually stated a political pressure as a reason to withdraw. And in a later statements from Visa chiefs, MasterCard, and Stripe, also a big online payment company, they're all saying that they received the letters from the legislators, senators, and states asking them to reconsider the involvement in Facebook's Libra cryptocurrency project. This was a kind of a direct intervention from the regulators in order to slow down this project. After PayPal announced it first, as I said, many other companies will leave the Libra Association and the developments around Facebook's Libra. But nevertheless, Libra Association, as Marilia mentioned, is chartered in Geneva on October 14th. Instead of initial 28 members, it has now 21 members. And from the big tech companies in association now, we can mention Lyft, Uber, Spotify, Vodafone as a telephone carrier, and other crypto companies which will be working on developing the solutions for online payments. Facebook is represented through his subsidiary firm, which is called Calibra. As I said, these companies, Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, stated specific political influence or reasons to actually withdraw from the project. We heard a few days before that, we heard statements from Germany and France, UK, Japan, and from the G7 Financial Stability Board that Libra will not be released or will be actually banned if tried to release, if it's not fully complied with global regulation on money transfer, anti-money laundering, and counter-financing terrorism side laws and bylaws. So in the midst of all of that, on October 23rd, sorry, Mark Zuckerberg was summoned for a hearing in front of the U.S. Senate on housing and banking issues. And it was a long 6.5-hour hearing, covered many other issues and topics around Facebook, not just cryptocurrency project Libra. And during that hearing, Zuckerberg actually said multiple times that Libra is intended is designed to work as a payment system and not a currency. It will not undermine national currencies and financial policies around them. He also mentioned that Libra will not launch anywhere in the world if it's not fully complied to the U.S. law. and also mentioned that will comply with the financial regulations, as I mentioned, around anti-money laundering and countering financing terrorism, which are posed by a G20's group financial watchdog, which is called Financial Action Task Force. Financial Action Task Force is actually making rules for international transaction and financial systems. So Mr. Zuckerberg said they are working closely with the FATF, Financial Action Task Force, in order to implement all of these security features into the future cryptocurrency. Well, general notion of this hearing was actually, and the position from Libra and Facebook was actually that this is a great innovation in the field of financial transactions, and basically the notion was, as Zuckerberg said it, let me quote it, its biggest question of the future is competitiveness. So basically they're saying if we don't do it, China will do it. And he keeps comparing the future Libra with the WeChat, which already has a program for payments via messaging systems. So this was a general notion, if we don't do it, China will do it. And one day after the Zuckerberg's hearing in the Senate, China's president, Xi Jinping, speaking at the Political Bureau of the Central Committee, actually said that the country needs to seize the opportunity on adopting blockchain technology in all fields, in all industries in China. So this was a kind of a direct answer to this Senate hearing, and following that news, yesterday and the day before, today we heard news from China that financial institutions and central banks of China are now actually pushing an aggressive agenda toward blockchain, use of blockchain in financial services, use of blockchain for payments, etc. So basically, on a global scale, it's a battle between Facebook and China on who's going to do it first. Well, one interesting note from the hearing is, as Marilia mentioned, and the Libra Association is chartered in Geneva, and when asked from senators how will they, maybe Facebook, reconsider that decision and launch from the U.S. or relocate the Libra Association in the U.S. United States, Mr. Zuckerberg stated that he cannot make that decision, and the Libra Association is independent, not-for-profit organization, and Facebook will not actually have an influence on decision in the Libra Association. That will be in short, because we're already short in time. Any other question, please ask. I will answer in chat. Thanks, Marilia.
Thank you very much, Arvin, for covering these developments. It's interesting to see the geopolitical connotations emerging in several of the digital issues that we are discussing, and cryptocurrencies are definitely one of them now, in which we will see a competition increasing between US and China, probably in the future. Moving on to the last part of this briefing, we're going to talk about some of the important events that will take place in the month of November. Starting with the Icann meeting, we do have Nigel Hickson with us, and I think George Sadowski was with us as well, who are knowledgeable about what's going on in Icann. But in short terms, there will be discussions of many of the policy development processes that are going on in the organizations related to new top-level domains, compliance with GDPR, rights protection mechanisms. And there are also two topics that will be particularly highlighted in this upcoming meeting. One of them is DNS abuse. What are the current DNS security threats? How do we define DNS abuse, what are the mitigation efforts that can be taken by different parties to face this problem. So there will be a good chunk of the meeting dedicated to discuss that, and to a discussion of Icann's multi-stakeholder model that, as we know, is a very original construction, and actors are looking inwards how they can perfect the model and make it work better for all stakeholders. There are other events taking place. We're going to just highlight a few of them. You can see all of them in the slide. The second one that we would like to highlight, actually I mentioned before, it is that the deadline for comments on the OECD tax proposal, it's coming. So it's a very important proposal. I hope that they do have a good participation in this public consultation. We also have a e-waste world conference that will take place in November in Frankfurt. As we mentioned before, environmental issues are gaining prominence, perhaps in internet governance circles. We have not given due attention to the intersection between digital and environment, but there has been more and more conferences dedicated to these topics lately, and there's this important one coming up in Frankfurt in November. The UN is organizing its annual meeting on business and human rights. It is an annual opportunity that the countries and other stakeholders have to review the main framework that the UN has in place to discuss human rights in the private sector, which is known as the Ruggie principles. As we know, states have the responsibility to protect human rights, but the private sector has the responsibility to respect human rights frameworks, and they're going to discuss how the applicability of this framework can be reinforced on the national level, and how different countries can really observe this responsibility that they have to oversee the private sector in respecting human rights principles. And last but not least, the last event that we would like to highlight is the Internet Governance Forum, which will happen in the last bit of November. As we know, it will take place in Berlin, and it's an excellent opportunity for different stakeholders to discuss the whole range of issues that are part of the Internet governance umbrella. There will be different parts in this meeting as well. There will be a separate meeting for parliamentarians who are attending the IGF, trying to reinforce the participation of governments and especially of parliaments, who have become very important actors in this playing field. And as always, there will be interesting sessions on the different baskets related to Internet governance. So it's definitely an event in which the digital community will converge to in the end of November. Diplo will be there, so we hope to see you there as well. And perhaps just to close this part of the briefing, a few updates from our side. It has been mentioned a couple of times before. We will have our newsletter coming up by the end of the month, so stay tuned for that. And perhaps another thing that I would like to call attention to is the webinar that we will be organizing on the 7th of November on applicability of international law to cyberspace. This is an event that we are organizing with the support of Microsoft and under the framework of discussions of the UN GGE and the open-ended working group. It's a very important debate on how we apply international law to cyberspace and how necessarily we can do it. What are the sticky points? What are the challenges that we have? So we will get together with some interesting scholars in the field, and we will discuss the applicability of international law. Please register for this webinar. The registrations are open now. And this is it for this part of the briefing. We are now going to pass to the regional developments. Before that, I do acknowledge that have been a couple of questions asked in the chat by Dennis, by Nigel Hickson, but I believe that they have been addressed in the chat by our presenters today. And so since we are in the top of the hour, then I'm going to pass directly to the regional developments and pass the microphone to Adriana, who is going to take us on a tour with regards to what's happening in different regions around the world. Adriana, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the roundup of the developments, and thank you for your question. We now have regional updates, so please stay with us. First, we have Amrita Chowdhury with updates from Asia, specifically on China's amended personal data protection law, and other updates from Sri Lanka, Singapore, and Australia. Amrita, over to you.
Hello and welcome to the regional update from Asia for the month of October. The Personal Data Protection Regulation related to children came into effect in China. The regulation applies to the personal data of children under the age of 14. However, it is unclear how the regulation will apply to service providers located overseas. The Sri Lankan Ministry of Digital Infrastructure and Information Technology published the final draft of the Personal Data Protection Bill. Singapore's fake news law has now taken effect, raising new concerns of freedom of expression. The Protection from Online Falsehood and Manipulation Act, passed in May this year, gives the government power to take down of any content deemed to be malicious and damaging to the country's interest. The Australian National University has released a detailed incident report of the data breach they suffered late 2018. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre has published a small business cybersecurity guide designed for small businesses to understand the various cyber threats, take action, and increase their cybersecurity resilience. The Ministry of Industry and Information Technology in China has announced that starting December 1st, Chinese citizens will have to allow telecommunication carriers to scan their faces when signing up for an internet access or to get a new mobile number. The 6th World Internet Conference, or the Wuhan Internet Summit, was organized from 20th to 22nd of this month. The theme this year was Intelligent Interconnection for Openness and Cooperation, Building a Community with Shared Future in Cyberspace. Over 1,500 participants from 80 countries participated in this event. That is all from me this month. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrita. Next, we have Grace Mutungu. Grace will highlight developments from Africa. She will share updates on Affordability Index for Africa and infrastructure development in Ethiopia. Grace, over to you.
Welcome to October Updates from Africa 2019. This is a month when the Affordability Index report came out, and for Africa, a lot of countries definitely have an affordable internet compared to people's income. And while a few countries have improved in communications infrastructure, they still score low on the affordability index. It's been said it's because of the lack of competition within domestic markets, and so African governments and stakeholders have to do more to ensure that the right policies and frameworks are in place for more competition within the markets. In other news, Ethiopia has, the government of Ethiopia has put out a call for consultations about its intention to issue 2 new telecommunications licenses. Now, this is big coming from Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is a country that has had, singularity for many, many years, and even in the telecom market for a long time, or since it began, there has only been one state-owned mobile network operator or telecommunications operator, and so this is big coming from Ethiopia. And still on issues telecommunications, the Economic Community of West Africa, ECOWAS, has announced that come January 2020, citizens will be able to communicate without roaming charges within the region, which means that citizens of ECOWAS member states will be able to move from country to country and make their calls without incurring any international roaming charges. That's a really positive step towards affordability of communication services, and it is hoped that other regional economic communities in the continent will do the same.
Thanks, Grace. We now have Noha Fatih with updates from the Middle East and North Africa region. Noha will update us on internet shutdowns in Iraq and Syria and the spread of fake news during the election campaign in Tunisia. Over to Noha.
Hello, this is Noha Fatih. I cover internet governance developments in the Middle East and North Africa region. The first update in October is from Iraq. On the 2nd of October, NetBlocks reported that the Iraqi authorities had disabled access to social media channels, including Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, as well as messaging application WhatsApp. Several days later, on the 8th of October, internet access was cut off in Baghdad amid violent anti-government protests. Yet services remained accessible via virtual private networks, which allowed Iraqis to document and follow the events taking place during the protests on social media. After such events, an Iraqi lawyer filed a lawsuit against the Iraqi Minister of Telecommunications for restricting internet access during the protest and requested compensation for the damage of infringement on freedom. Internet blackout was also reported this month in Syria. The Guardian reported an internet shutdown across northeastern Syria on the 13th of October. During this period, phones stopped working and the streets were also left empty. The last update is from Tunisia. During the 3 elections that Tunisia witnessed from mid-September to mid-October this year, misinformation was spread on social media platforms, where unofficial Facebook pages without clear affiliation diffused disinformation and sponsored content praising certain parties. They produced more than 38% of the political messages between mid-May to mid-July this year. The fake news, which aimed at adversely influencing citizens, including presidential candidates withdrawing to support other parties, political figures or celebrities supporting certain candidates, the arrest of some candidates, and the assault of a polling center official by a candidate. Thank you.
Thank you, Noha. At the end, we will hear from Andre Edwards with updates from the Caribbean region. Andre will update us on developments around digital asset regulation in the Caribbean. Andre, please go ahead.
Andre Edwards with Caribbean updates. The Eastern Caribbean Central Bank launches a pilot digital version of EC Dollar. The Eastern Caribbean Central Bank has used its mobile app, DXCD Caribbean, to launch a pilot digital version of the Eastern Caribbean dollar. The ECCB's governor indicated that the app is rooted in the bank's commitment and focus on innovation and digital transformation. The governor expects this digital form of the currency to reduce the 80 to 90% of paper payment transactions regionally and drive the cost per transaction down. The app allows for payments to be processed and funds to be deducted from a digital wallet balance and credited to a merchant's balance in real time. To address security and data integrity concerns, the ECCB will be leveraging a private commission blockchain to maintain confidentiality, and credentials will be required for accessing the network. Bermuda starts accepting stablecoin USDC for tax payments. Bermuda's government has begun accepting USD coin, or USDC, which is a USD-backed stablecoin from Coinbase and Circle for the payment of taxes, fees, and government services. This makes Bermuda one of the first countries to accept a stablecoin for taxes and government services from its 60,000 residents. This follows Ohio's recent suspension of its online portal where businesses pay taxes using digital currency. This development is part of the government's wider initiative of supporting USD dollar-backed stablecoins and decentralization of finance protocols and services.
Thank you, Andre. And once again, thank you to Amrita, Grace, and Noha for sharing the updates from their regions. That brings us to the end of our October briefing, and I will now give the floor back to Marilia.
Thank you very much, Andriana, and thanks to our curators spread all around the world who bring us these regional updates. Thanks to Arvin, Serena, Adriana, Vladimir for joining us for the briefing today. And thank you all for taking the time to participate. And we hope to see you again towards the end of November with November updates. And we hope to see you in the IGF if you are attending. Thank you very much and have a nice morning or afternoon.